The next objective I will be looking at is to examine a range of ethical dilemmas in order to highlight strengths and weaknesses of different ethical schools. I've chosen this one because it allows me to quickly introduce some ethical schools, the three foundational ones, without going into too much detail, but just sort of a working definition or an operational definition of these three, and then look at a ethical dilemma. And then, as a philosophy is wont to do, appraise the ethical dilemma from a meta-ethical position. So the first is consequentialism. As you can guess by the name, this tells us that what is good is that which has good consequences. Good, of course, is the very tricky term here, and so there are different kinds of consequentialism. One is egoism, and that says that the consequences of the actions are good if they are good to me. And I don't have to define good there, because I know what I consider to be good for myself. If it benefits me, if it's in my interest, if it's what I wanted, then the consequences of any action is geared on me. We can invert that and say, what about some sort of altruistic consequentialism? So whatever I do, if it benefits my community or those around me, is good, and if it doesn't benefit them, it's bad. We're still locating the content of our judgment in consequences. Utilitarianism is the most famous one here, and this is the one we will be doing in the rest of this course. And it has a nice little calculus. Utilitarianism says that which results in the most happiness for the greatest amount of people is morally good. It seems a little simple on the surface. It's actually quite difficult to figure out this calculus, because you want to maximize the amount of people and you want to maximize the happiness each of those individuals has. So if you know anything about economics, it's closer to a Pareto optimality than to a brute majority. And there are some scenarios we can imagine. I mean, if I make 49 people unhappy and 51 people 1% happier, or if I make only a third of people happier, but I make them 1,000% happier, we have to begin to do some calculation there. So it's not simply a brute numbers, straightforward, majoritarian attitude. And there are kinds of utilitarianism that we'll get into later. There's act and rule utilitarianism. So it gets pretty complex if you go deeply into this, but the basic idea is to bring as much happiness to as many people as you can. And if you do so, you've acted morally well. The second is deontology. This is to follow the right rules, and to do so makes you moral. Religions work in this way. You have the list of commandments, you follow those, you've done well. These don't have exceptions. They typically give you a reason for why you should follow these commandments, but it's not good enough to say I had to break a commandment to try to keep with the spirit of the commandment, because the commandments in all religions, all monotheistic at least religions, are sacrosanct. There is no exception. Thou shalt not murder unless. There are no footnotes or asterisks indicating the exceptions to these. In this course, we'll be looking at the Immanuel Kant. This is one version of his rule. Never treat others as a means. Treat them always as an end in themselves. Don't use people for your end or someone else's ends. Human dignity, autonomy, these are the ideas that are core here. He will later introduce the idea of the categorical imperative, which I will get to a little bit later today. But that's his rule, and he says if you follow this rule, then your actions will be moral. And so here we don't look at the consequences of the actions. It's not follow this rule unless it will lead to hurting someone. That's irrelevant. Kant, in fact, was a great opponent of utilitarianism precisely because of unintended consequences. If I'm responsible for the consequences of my action, and the world is an incredibly complex place. Maybe the one thing I said to someone when I was lost in Venezuela 4 years ago led to horrific consequences, and I just made a quick, casual, offhanded remark while chatting to someone in a bus stop. Now, is that my responsibility or problem, and should I be banished for that? And Kant says, no, you have no control over these things, and so what you do have control over is whether you decide to act according to a rule or not. And that is all that's important in this ethical sense. The third one we'll be doing today, which is very different from the other two, is virtue ethics. It's very different because it doesn't have any of these formulas that the previous two have. There's no pithy rule, there's no calculation. It's a much more evaluative position, really, and that is to act as a virtuous person would act. Of course, what is a virtuous person? This is the cardinal question, and Aristotle is the major proponent of this that we will adhere to in this course. And for him, a virtue is a middle ground between two vices, an extreme and a lack. The classic example is perhaps bravery. If you're much too brave and you run out into the battlefield with a sword and there's a bunch of machine guns pointed at you, that's it's not very smart. It's way too brave, and it's actually not brave perhaps, but foolhardy or idiotic. Not to have any bravery and to be cowardly would be the other extreme of this vice, the deficiency of this vice. And so somewhere in the middle is the virtue of bravery, and this will change depending on context. Sometimes it's really brave to de-escalate the situation. Sometimes it's brave to go in guns blazing. Sometimes it's really brave to take a risk. Sometimes it's really brave not to take a risk, depending on the context. And so he gives us that space, very flexible framework. Okay, and so now let's apply these. I've taken the trolley problem. I've left the definitions of utilitarianism, Kantianism, and Aristotle down on the bottom. And the trolley problem I'll go through fairly quickly. And then I would like to discuss the trolley problem as such. And the trolley problem is, okay, there's a train coming down a track. It's heading towards group A, 4 people strapped to the track, and they will be run over and killed by this train if you do nothing. You can flip a lever and you can move the train onto a second track, and there's only one individual there. And so a crude utilitarian analysis will tell us flip the switch and move the train to track B, because one person's death will most likely lead to less unhappiness in the world than 4 people's deaths. We have to think about maybe they have family, maybe they have extended networks, maybe they are community leaders or not. So we have to do some calculation. We probably don't have time, depending on how fast or how far away this train is, to go and interview these people and see if they're lying or not, and try to fully ascertain the consequences of their death. But a quick heuristic would be 4-1, we flip the switch. A Kantian would say you can never treat one person as a means, and so you can't sacrifice the person on track B to save the 4 people on track A. You can't use a person in this way. So he says do nothing. Inaction for Kant is not actually an action. So he just says do nothing. Right. This is the big difference that we see in very many debates. Abortion is one of these debates where it's either killing or letting die. If I'm a trained doctor and I see a car wreck on the side of the road, and I realize that these people need urgent medical care or they will not make it, and I don't stop, then I'm letting them die. Very different to me walking up and running over them with my car, killing them. How far this difference extends and how well we can differentiate between these two of killing and letting die is a very tricky question. But in this case, Kant would say do nothing, because the moment you touch that lever, you've acted in a purposeful manner to use the one person on track to save the 4 people on track A, and you may not do so. So he says do nothing, and your conscience could be clear because you've acted according to his rule, says Immanuel Kant. Aristotle, this is pretty much the impossible question, but what would a virtuous person do here? I don't know. I don't know. I think the virtuous person would laugh at this very artificial scenario and say this is absurd. We can complicate this a little bit, of course. Add some more. So add babies or add 2 people on track B and 4 people on track A. Now, do you flip the switch or not? This is a slightly more complex question, because we have to think of happiness. Does the baby, or do the babies experience happiness? They could experience more happiness than the people on track A or B, because they presumably have many more years of life ahead of them. And if they have happy lives, then they live until 90, they have potentially 80 and a half years of happiness ahead of them. And the people on track B may be 70 and probably only have, another 10 or 15 years of happiness in their lives. Maybe you look at them and they look like very sad people anyway, and it's not going to take away much happiness from them or other people in the world than the babies. But then do the 2 babies with their potentially long lives outvalue the 4 teenagers trapped on track A? It gets a bit messy, this calculus. And the trolley problem, famous as it is in ethical thought experiments, is really not a very good thought experiment. Here we can say something like, we can just make this more complex for the fun of it and say there's 4 innocent people on track A. I don't know what an innocent person is. No one is innocent, really. We've all done something, but let's say generally innocent or relatively innocent of major harm to others. Track B, we have one loved one person that is very close to us, and track C, 3 murderers and a presumably also innocent baby. What do? Utilitarian, I mean, you go for the numbers game. You look at happiness. The happiness probably save track A, and probably, kill the loved one, because it's one loved one. I'll be super sad. Those around me will be sad, but 4 innocents live. They have potentially 4 families and other networks, and there's more people there. Kant, again, do nothing. You cannot make that decision. And Aristotle will say probably self-sacrifice, take B, right? The baby is hard. The 4 innocents, that's hard. Take one for the team and take B. But that's just my interpretation of Aristotle, and other people will we'll disagree on that one. And so some more interesting dilemmas, I think, because the idea of this trolley problem really highlights what many thought experiments are designed to do, and they're designed to appeal to our intuitions in an incredibly isolated and superficial manner. Now, the trolley problem example, which many people give and like to use as an example of ethics, if we think of this as a real example, then of course one has to ask, how did I get into this position where I can flip this switch? And how did those people get strapped to that train track? And are there really no other options here? Can I not wave down the train? Or how does this very artificial scenario exist? And once we take that immense context and history into account, we're in a much better way to make any ethical decision, because nothing in this world happens in isolation. There's always this background and this extra information. And the real world is immensely complex, and to abstract is probably in itself an unethical move to make. People always claim that they've been quoted out of context. That is true. People are always quoted out of context. And so if you want to quote someone in a meaningful way, then you have to try and build up some of that context and give them the background from which the meaning of their actions derive. And so, okay, so that dilemma, the trolley dilemma, is not a very good one, I think. But nonetheless, it has to be shown, because if you watch any other YouTube videos or you read any book on ethics, they'll start with something like this. A much better example that I would like to see take the stage is medical ethics, right? Organ donation. There are always more people that need organs than there are available organs. And so in a real world, we have to make a decision who gets this organ. And it could be that, okay, it's the person most likely to accept this organ. So it would be a successful transplant. But then we also factor in always things like, has this person any other medical concerns? What if it's a transplant of an eye, and yet the two candidates that are there, one is a very heavy drinker and therefore has probably a reduced lifespan due to heavy drinking, and the other person does not. And then we take some more factors into account. What if the one has been to prison? Does that take you off of the organ donation list or move you lower down the list or not? Should it or not? And these are real questions that we have to face all the time, and it gets a lot more accentuated in times of crises. Natural disasters, a town gets flooded, and in the first couple of days, you can only take so many supplies with you. Food, medicine, shelter, who gets them? And so these are much more interesting and applicable and relevant examples. And so I've tried to come up with a few that are potentially relevant and useful in this way, but still simple enough for us to be able to tackle. And the first is, a company can use more expensive, eco-friendly resources, but they will have to fire some employees. Or they can go the non-eco-friendly route with their resources and retain those employees. The utilitarian, first we have to see who is involved. There are the employees, there's the company, there's presumably the shareholders and the stakeholders associated with the company. We're talking eco-friendly resources. So perhaps wherever this company is located or where the resources are coming from, there is pollution or some harm to the environment. So the people who are living or operating or being around that area, we have to decide whether we want to take future people into account or not. If we continue to harm our environments and pollute heavily, are we doing immense harm to the uncountable billions of people who may or may not be born in the future, because then they just outweigh us automatically. And we'd have to see what happens here. If this company is very, very, very tiny and the harm is such that by all foreseeable expectations in 2 years, technology will allow us to undo this harm, and in fact this company is working on that technology, then perhaps the harm is not that great, and it's better to retain the employees and not leave them for the moment jobless. If these employees are people who are highly sought after in the industry and they could easily find another job, then maybe it's not a problem. So you'd have to do an analysis according to those lines. Kantian ethics, well, sacrificing some people's jobs for more eco-friendly resources, Kant would say probably no to that. You are treating these people as just any other resource to buy and sell or fire at will to achieve some other goal, but it's not that straightforward. We'd have to look at the contracts available. We'd have to look at the willingness of the employees to maybe step down from their roles. There are other avenues here. Aristotle's virtue ethics. What is the middle ground here? Well, something a bit more idealistic, like let's get the employees together, present them the problem and discuss and see how they feel. And those that would like to leave can leave, and those who can find other jobs can do so. And we can give them a couple of months of severance pay to help them bridge. And then we can also phase in the eco-friendly resources over time to allow more time or resources for our fellow employees to find new jobs if they need something a little bit more mature than, fire them all or don't fire them all. And the second one I won't go into in much detail, but this is, do governments secretly surveil us more and thereby increase our safety but invade our privacy? Or do we increase our privacy but then miss potential dangerous criminal acts? It was quite some time ago when CCTVs in public really hit the scene, and I was in London when I came across the idea that I'm just constantly being filmed by public facing cameras, and as I walked I would just check, and like, yes, someone can track me throughout the day, all day. Of course, also online I can be tracked, my phone can be tracked, you can triangulate where I am based on the pings of my cell phone, for example. Many law enforcement agencies have asked cell phone service providers to reveal these documents to government employees in order to combat crime or what have you. So do we trade off privacy for a potential less harm to society by catching criminals, and let's say dangerous criminals here? Or do we not? Utilitarianism, you do the analysis. Kant, difficult question, once again, but it would probably be using people and invading their privacy and even their dignity and autonomy to stop potential dangerous crimes that you don't even know about yet. That seems a bit hopeful. Kant would say no. Aristotle, as usual, would say, let's find a common medium here. Let's not surveil everyone, but let's surveil those people who we can reasonably assume to be involved in crime, or something along those lines. Strengths and weaknesses I'll go through fairly quickly because of time constraints. So the strength of utilitarianism is it's fairly easy. I put a question mark there, but we have our calculus, and we have to apply this calculus, and we end up with something like actually a numerical value, or at least a ratio between these two. It also has clear and practical guidelines. Yes, there are very complex situations, sure, but in your day-to-day life, you can decide what the consequences will be, and you can act accordingly. And it allows flexibility, because in certain contexts you will act in one way, and in other contexts in a different way. Weaknesses: justice. This is probably the most fundamental threat to brute utilitarianism, sacrificing one for the many. And we all feel that, human rights or something are inalienable, and you can't just use me to make other people happy or kill me to benefit others willy-nilly. Can we really quantify happiness? Is there a calculus for happiness? That seems a very, very odd way to think about humanity. Some people may argue that life is a lot richer than simply, being more happy than others or than previously. There's deep satisfaction in life, there's overcoming challenges, there's being in a challenging situation which may not be happy, but it helps you grow as a person and develop, your identity, etc., etc. Also, then, if the goal here is happiness, then just put happy chemicals in the water and make everyone all happy. That seems to be the really quick shortcut here to maximize happiness, which we all also feel is a bit weird, and that there's something missing about life if we do that. And then the last point I'll raise is that is not wrong in itself. Is there a potential context where even the most horrific act could be seen as good, depending on context and consequence? Kant, good strengths about him and his position. Human dignity, right? He takes human dignity seriously, and I think many of us feel intuitively human dignity is something to be taken seriously. As he points out in his own critique of utilitarianism, consequences can be out of our control, and it's quite something to be held responsible for those. And also, for Kant, some things are just always wrong. Never torture violently and brutally some innocent youth. They just never do that, regardless of consequence. That just seems something that we would never want to do. And we can look to much more realistic examples like racial segregation. Just never do that, regardless of the consequence, which our world has done many times. Or other kinds of segregation in terms of qualities that people have but have no control over. Things like eye color or whatever. Weaknesses, it can lead to serious harms, right? If you follow this rule regardless of consequences, there are times when following this rule will lead to serious harms. And one such harm could be, let's take an easy example, because I've mentioned torture and stuff, so let's go for a much more lightweight example. And this is if you have children and you say you never lie to your kids. Kant says lying is not allowed. And so you're the one who tells all the children that Father Christmas or Santa Claus doesn't exist, and you create pandemonium in the kindergarten because your rule says don't lie. Whether that was really the ethical thing to do in this case is at least debatable and not as clear-cut as Kant makes us or would like us to believe. The inquiring murderer, this is simply, if I'm at home, my friend who I know does not deserve death says, please, someone is trying to kill me, hide me. And I hide my friend, and then the murderer knocks on my door and says, hi, do you have this person? And Kant says, don't lie. So you have to say, yes, I have this person. And then this person gets killed. The consequence, not your problem. You followed the rule. You didn't lie. And we can think about this when many people, most famously a Dutch family, were hiding Jews. And the SS would ask, where are the Jews? Are you hiding any Jews? And we have Anne Frank's diary, which is a great version of that. And Kant would say, yeah, no, they're there in the false ceiling right there. And then lastly, is rule following an ethical thing? And this is a very important point. Rule following is in itself not a challenging thing necessarily. But knowing which rules to apply when, exercising your own judgment, taking responsibility for your actions, this is perhaps what ethics is. And I like to think about it, if you can't fail at ethics, then you're not doing ethics. There's always the possibility of getting it wrong. Therefore, we have this responsibility, we have this gravity deciding how to act. And we know that we can get it wrong. And in the face of this risk, we do the best we can. And that, I think, is ethics. But simply rule following is perhaps not to take on this responsibility and this depth of human character. Aristotle, it's flexible because in different contexts you go for it. No rules, and so it's experience and practice. Over time you learn how to identify the virtues, and over time you learn how to be virtuous. And if you make a couple mistakes, that's fine, as long as you're improving. And so in this case, it's a very nice human-centered way of doing ethics. The weaknesses cannot guide action, right? We like to have laws in our society that regulate behavior in public when we are hundreds of thousands or millions of people living together. And to simply say, oh, well, do that what you think is virtuous, could lead to a little bit of confusion, chaos, and unintended serious harms. And then secondly, is not merely relativistic. In some cultures, whatever is the golden mean, the midway between two extremes of a vice and deficiency, may not be seen as virtuous. It may be that self-sacrifice for the group is considered to be a duty that every individual has in some societies, and in our more individualistic Western societies, running out onto the battlefield with all the guns you can muster to try to single-handedly take out the enemy is not considered a very dutiful thing.